Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Hello and welcome to the Grid Mod Pod. Today we have Dr. Elizabeth Cook with us again today, and we'll be speaking on integrated system planning. Dr. Cook is a professor in that topic, and I say professor loosely because she is a planning extraordinaire, in my opinion. So
I like that.
It's an honor to have her.
I'm so happy to be here today. So thank you, Francis.
So Dr. Cook, we'll get into the questions as we start. So how is the traditional approach of electricity planning evolving to address the challenges like decarbonization, increased electrification, and DR integration? It's a good one to start with.
Yes, that is kind of the baseline of the drivers of grid modernization. And I believe the longer that I have the privilege and benefit to host the Grid Mod Pod and also become I like that, professor of integrated system planning, I want to caveat it. We should be calling it integrated system planning and operations. So I want to start a trend where all of those that are actively working on planning should tie into the power of operations. But I'll get off my soapbox for a second on that one. Another thing I thought was interesting, and I had the privilege to be a moderator of a panel at ESIG, which is Energy Systems Integration Group, where we hosted multiple experts in this space. And I think my biggest takeaway is we had someone from China, someone from Germany overseeing the European Union overall grid, and then we had someone from Excel, and then two gentlemen that spoke on the effort and the work that's being sponsored to develop the integrated system planning guidebook. And so my takeaway was everyone had a different definition, and the power of it, just what the power of language can do to really kick off any type of discussion. So for here, what we're going to talk about, not really integrating generation such as, nuclear, hydrogen, gas as a layering, which is some terminology. Other integrated resource planning is really all about the layering of the energy resources. And I think when we have been talking about it, especially across the states, integrated system planning, aka caveat integrated distribution system planning, we focused tremendously on the distribution grid. But what a lot of utilities are starting to realize, and it's been around for about over a decade, is the need to integrate the distribution and transmission system planning, and more recently, the operations of it. So, how is the traditional approach to planning? Traditionally, we really planned the transmission grid with its bulk generation resources, and then we planned the distribution really based on our customer very predictable forecast. And we would just tell or inform the G&T folk of how much projected load will be needed, and then they would go run their plans. But where we're at now, from a non-traditional, aka moving away from something that we've been doing consistently for 80, 90 years, to a space of realizing with everything happening with inverter-based resources, really creating an energy resource that doesn't produce carbon. Also, becoming very aware the global market around electrification, such as electrifying our transportation fleets, electrifying our heating and cooling systems, aka the increase of electrification, and or one could say, which I don't want to say in this episode, Francis, but I will. But do you know what I'm about to say? The explosion of the need for data, right? And then lastly, when we talk about, I always want to caveat, especially for any new listeners, distributed energy resources, which is fundamentally a dynamic load that our now customers have autonomy or can have autonomy over. The idea that they may pull from the grid as a load, or they may inject electrons as a generation source. So that's what's shifting. And we've been talking about it in many silos. And so what I like about the Grid Mod Pod is bringing all of the experts that are in charge of all of their plans and really connect the dots of the need to integrate those plans to really allow us to do scenario planning and really coordinate across all three and our customer four. And so that, in a nutshell, is integrated system planning and operations. Thanks for asking.
Well, you're welcome anytime. So you talk about siloed, right? And what are some of the key drivers forcing this change? And why it cannot continue to be in this siloed planning method? Why?
I'm fresh off of a workshop that the AEIC Center for Operational Excellence, someone told us yesterday, no, maybe it was Tuesday night during dinner, that all of my words create a very long title. I won't tell you the full title. I think that was long enough. But we were really in the room with asset management experts and leaders of the industry. We had 29 folk that were coming together, and I brought the asset management folk in to really plant the seeds and bring awareness of how important it is that their plans, their assessments of their asset fleet are a big component of how the overall system can be planned. So one of the questions that was asked is, there's a lot of mandates and or external drivers that tend to trickle into the utilities and fundamentally just reinvent or reword, dare I say, some of the fundamental philosophies that the bulk electric transmission and or distribution grid have been doing for decades. And so I just think it's interesting. So when we say, what are the driving forces? It's kind of catch-22, and I think it gets us stuck a lot. But, of course, some say climate policy mandates, right? However, those that are living and breathing the operation of the grid, fundamentally, and especially if they've been there for more than 2 decades, storms have gotten worse. And one could say it's climate policy mandates, but others could say, we actually need to think of how we build out the system from a resilient, aka what are our various reliability projects and how do they allow us to be more resilient, which is another way of saying hardening the grid. So all that to say is extreme weather and or other mandates that are saying, let's look at this differently. I mean, that's fundamentally all we're saying. The other is, we mentioned, there is now a demand for electrification, right? It's the low adoption space, but then once you get into that whole, we all can think back of what we've been taught about Henry Ford and the first T model. Nobody had a car. Remember, there's a visual going around the internet right now. Like in 1904, there was all horse and buggy in one car. Don't quote me, it might be 914. But 10 years later, it was all cars, one horse and buggy.
Yeah.
And another fact you can think about, I've been reading, about just media and how it came to be. But in the 1980s, only 2% of the population had a television. And by the end, it was 88%. So there's this phenomena that we all know of, but we're really not accepting. So there's a demand for these new technologies that have been proven over and over to be more efficient, which is showing a trajectory of load growth. And then the other is, we've been able to develop technology that is an intermittent generation resource, and it is typically connected to the grid by an inverter. And that in itself created new technological challenges, which is something that we have not dealt with. And so we put them on the grid, but because of all of, I could say a lot, wrong, right, or indifferent, we really haven't the possibilities from a larger systems of systems. We really siloed the perspective of what needs to be looked at and what can evolve, such as the things that currently do connect. Could we adapt? Could we address? Could we make how they respond to certain outages be a part of this intermittency? Or should we stay siloed where we're not really thinking about how those can actually work together seamlessly? So I would say I think that's enough, right? I mean, we all talk about them, again, in silos, but this is why I believe the GridMod Pod has a beautiful platform to capture these interdependencies across the grid segments, really talk about there is inefficiencies and we're missing some synergies. So how can we all effectively work together for this transition? I got on the soapbox on that one too again.
So I'm very happy that you mentioned, the changes in the weather and the hurricanes that are more frequent. Being from the Caribbean, I will tell you, my island of Grenada, within the past, I will say 20, 25 years, had probably at least four hurricanes, at least one, category 3, two category 3, and at least a category 1 or so. I do agree that system planning, the difference in the weather pattern is as important. The analytics and how, you mentioned resiliency as much as we talk about reliability, although there is no measuring stick for resiliency in the industry, it is very important to rebound as quick as possible. So I'm glad you touched on that. But let's continue on this part here. I too don't want to get into a soapbox on Caribbean geography and all that. So explain to us some of the dimensions of the power system planning, like the scope, the scale, the action, and how can they apply in different system planning areas. I think you touched on it a while ago when you talk about generation planning
Right.
and all that. Just go into more depth for a newcomer to the show.
Right. Okay. So, well, there are 4 parts of the grid that when we think about it, it's bulk generation. So this is the massive, when I say massive, we're talking anywhere from like 100 megawatts, 500 megawatts, up to like 2,500 megawatt energy production. So generation, which means a node at a moment in time, every moment is injecting that much energy. And so what is energy? I mean, one could say it's the amount of what? The power is the force and the energy is the force over a certain amount of time. So that's a lot, right? And mostly the generation resources, especially with that massive inertia, they're really doing their analyses at a component perspective. So you have experts that are building their models, running the scenarios and simulations and ensuring that the equipment, which is fundamentally going to be the breaker in the substation that will open after the correct signals are received for that generator to safely shut down. We're going really high level there. But that phenomena requires a significant amount of analyses and understanding of all parts, massive rotational systems. So you have that. And what they really need is to ensure that what's happening on the transmission grid, so most large power stations have 1 or 2 or maybe 5 lines, let's just say, leaving. And so there's sensors. So there's like measurement equipment that is near real time for transmission and generation. We're talking microseconds, like within sub-cycles. They need to be monitoring what's happening in the massive grid that it's connected to so that it has adequate time to shut the system down, open the breaker, and therefore whatever happens on the transmission grid can no longer perturb the massive generator and things could go really bad really quick. So that's, there's a whole scope of that planning. Mostly out in the publicity and everyone's talking about it, if they're leaning in, is, the transmission planning. And that is studying many components. So I'm going to break it down for you. Ready?
Yeah.
So we're talking like the RTO ISO. So for anyone that's familiar with the energy industry, we've created these bodies of people that have an expertise that sit upon massive amount of grid infrastructure, and they're to be facilitating the amount of generation that needs to be dispatched and ensuring the availability of the transmission existed based on the distribution load being requested. So they don't really have a part per se, other than we, the transmission owners, I don't know why we're utility people, so are giving the data so that they can do this for all of us. So like PJM, one of the largest entities, has all the way from like Indiana to New Jersey down to Virginia up to, the border of PA and Virginia. So they're overseeing much of the grid. There's many studies they're doing. They're doing state estimator studies, which it means they're solving the power flow solution of every node, which we're talking probably 40,000 nodes in a very large matrix equation. Think Diffie-Q. Maybe not a lot of you know what I'm talking about, but matrix math. And every four minutes solving a massive computational system to say everything's good. And so to do that requires an enormous amount of labor and love and awareness of the data, the simulation power, and ensuring that everyone's doing their job. So that's like operations, and we won't go down there. But so what planning is sitting there doing is really planning for the future. So you have the present day system, and you have multiple utilities that have their aged infrastructure plans. So they're supplemental projects. So any projects that they deem need to be updated, assessed, whatever that may be, for their particular grid. Then you have interconnection studies. So all of these generators want to connect in all different places. So you're studying a time frame of all these generators. You also have these load deliverability and these generator deliverability. And I guess you can Google these terms, but these are robust studies to determine the current capability and then projected capability, which is there's a lot of uncertainty there, right? We live with uncertainty. And then within those studies, you have feasibility, system impact, and facilities. And you're doing a steady state, then a stability, which now you bring in real time to make sure the rotational masses can endure any type of fault on the situation. And then you have your facilities, where this is where you're kind of definitely going to connect, but is your substation. So your breakers and your transformers and all of the devices inside those fences that we all look at when we drive by and we're like, what's that? Those substations are being studied to ensure the equipment is appropriately designed. So that's a lot of studying. So when we talk about planning on the transmission grid, it's very layered and complex. And so a massive amount of data. So is that kind of the scale? And then they're studying really 3, 5, 10, 20 years out, because to build these large transmission, which we don't do much in the US, but that's another day, and build the generation, we're talking 5, 7, 10 years.
Yeah.
So you literally have to create systems to make sure these projects show up.
Uh-huh.
So that's transmission. Then you get into the distribution, and the distribution is typically very regional, geographically based. It's local. How you study the distribution system, the models are different. The analytics, something simple to think about is transmission's 3-phase balance, which means how you do the back end solutions behind the scenes that we all should look at a little bit is different with the single phase unbalanced distribution grid. And it's just how it's evolved, how it's been designed, how we've installed equipment on it. And so, you have a local engineer that takes pride in these individual circuits that run through their streets that they work in, and they're quantifying, the current load that they understand it to be. And then now with everything happening with the DER and that dynamic unknown, the way they think about forecasting and how they project is becoming very complex. You think I said enough? So those are when we talk planning, right? Those are the 3 components. And then the customer, that is human behavior. That's projection of adoption of technology. Now you're in a whole space of uncertainty. So think about that, layer to the distribution engineer who has to plan all of that, then layer that chunk of information to the transmission, and they have to do all that. So it's a must that we have to integrate. And the way the grid was designed, because it was very linear, there was a wake up, you go to bed, come home kind of thing. We really regimented our processes with that node. And so all of these components are kind of being tossed up, and all of this uncertainty is being built into processes that used to exist. So that's why we must integrate those types of studies together.
Right, definitely. So, from what you said, that means we have a lot of challenges, right? You mentioned inverter-based resources a while ago. You mentioned the technological advancements a while ago. So, tell me, what are some of the new challenges that integrated planning aims to address overall? Because there are a lot of challenges, but what what are some of the newer challenges that, you know, and not just they aim to address it, but how they're addressing it currently?
Someone said the other day that I have the gift of gab, and I still can't determine if that is a good gift. But, through my, years of working in industry, I have been very philosophical, right? I really always wanted to understand like why I was being asked to study certain things. I was very technical because all of those studies I just explained to you, I have partaked in. I kind of understand a lot of the assumptions and the variables. But really what interested me, especially when I got to a level where I was being asked to convince the higher powers to be, aka the financial gods and the regulatory gods. Just kidding. If it's a no or a yes or a no go, right? And you're the one who taught me no in this world of system planning really means next opportunity. But that in itself is a craft. But so what it is like the challenges we just spoke about, right? There's a world where this grid did not exist. The understanding of what it could be and what it would become, no one understood. And I will say I've been geeking out with the AEIC meeting minutes quite a bit. I'm on a kick, and I finished up 1885 to 1900. And I can't tell you the parallels and what really is transcending for me from a people perspective. Like, there were these gentlemen at the beginning, there was 6 of them that procured this piece of equipment that was going to light up the streets, but they already had kerosene, right? And they already had other mechanism, arc brush lighting. So they're really there was this innovative entity that said, we shall have light, and it's going to be electric light, and right, everything in it's like an unknown. And they got together to talk about how do we make it safe? How do we prevent the public, aka our customers, to think it is not something of value, right? And they were not being regulated. They didn't have any standards, but they wanted to come together and really speak to the phenomena of what exists, how it works, what can we do, what works best, what doesn't work. And so when we think about where we are today, we're transforming something that was into something that it could be without all of the answers no. And we're in a space in our society that I don't think we like that. We have massive amount of information that everyone can be the expert and everyone's putting in their opinion, but where is the true grounding sources to drive execution? So, and then on top of that is being able to mitigate the risk of the unknown and being incentivized to do that. So we're somewhat in a broken space where those that can do are within a system that's been created for something that was. And so how do we expedite that change? And I think, can I quote Arnold Schwarzenegger? I just listened to one of his podcasts and he literally said, it's called Get Pumped, but he was talking about the grid. And someone, I guess he was, all we got to do is keep on doing. Stop talking, but do. And I love that, right? So I think it's the essence of understanding the philosophy that we're sitting in, right? It really gets, less, it's not just this intellectual technology space. It's really how do we become experimental again? And how do we create space to allow the utilities and their partners, because we cannot do this alone, execute some of these known phenomena. Like we've piloted enough. So how do we like do that? So I think that's the challenge. So it's, the power of critical thinking, like evaluating arguments or identifying the assumptions and then like weighing evidence and then recognizing if there's bias and then being in a safe space to like acknowledge it and then make the next space. So I'm going real philosophical quick on you. I'll stop.
So that means there are a lot of opportunities in this space.
There's a
So
lot of what?
opportunities,
Yes, lots
they
of it.
do exist in the space. So what are some of those opportunities using capacity expansion modeling for integrated planning, particularly concerning co-optimization?
So when we think about it's this idea of questioning the status quo and leaning into the current tool sets and really like, do we have the best systems in place? And so I think, and I do feel like we're in a pivotal moment where this work is being done. It's really though, how do we gain the ingredients from a massive amount of, no pun intended, there's a massive amount of inertia occurring across the industry in the world to run these studies on base foundational core mechanisms. So truly what has to happen, and you can kind of lean into this space, is like, are we assessing the current computer models and base linkage of data? So we have the cleansed data, the accurate data, and then we're running these optimization type solutions that were not available to us when these first systems of models that we were running that were created. The backbone was created like in the 70s and 80s when you were very limited on the amount of computational power you had, right? So your mathematical equations and your inputs were very limited based on the technology that we had to crunch the numbers. And so we've exponentially has succeeded. I don't know if succeeds the word, exceeded any type of dream that the engineers of the 70s, 80s could imagine was available. So how do we transition that to a core engine, not a physical engine, but an engine of a computational engine to get us to those optimized solutions? And so I believe there's a lot of underlying current of that awareness and existence. And so there's the opportunity to build that core, create the awareness that this type of scenario planning must exist. And then once the answers are given, we have to have the bodies of people to agree and say yes to the overall processes that will be changed. So, going back, it's not an easy solution, but there's a great opportunity to get that bright-minded computer engineer and data architect in a room with this massive amount of data and start asking big questions and then starting to like embed those new processes into the systems that exist today. You want to do it with me? Let's go do that.
Yeah, I'm ready. Sign me up. Sign me up. So, stakeholder engagement is so important in everything we do in this industry. And every time we have one of these podcasts, I always talk about stakeholder engagement. So here it comes, my stakeholder engagement question of the day.
Okay.
How can we balance the complexity of the interdependent parts of the energy system with the particular needs for modeling, decision making, and stakeholder engagement? I must have a stakeholder engagement question.
Did you just give me a question with? Okay,
Everything.
So the complexity of interdependent parts of the energy system, which has 4 parts that we just defined, and then you're more or less, what are the needs from a modeling and then a decision making and a stakeholder engagement? Okay.
Right.
I mean, that's like why we're doing the Grid Mod Pod. And I think, this is also comes down to human behavior and needing to understand, one, how complex it is. And you could have you could be in your basement and you create literally the tool that could take in all of, say, the Eastern interconnection load flow data of the model and all of the dynamic data that we have existing with all of the labor of many scientists and engineers over the last 50 years and get a solution that you know is right. And you still will have a large uphill battle to gain acceptance by this massive industry. So it's all comes down, and a space of building trust among the people to bring the right conversations to the right table, to understand that all technologies could be viable components. There's no winners and losers. Like, we've created many technologies that can work together. So how do we put them all on the table and like create like a value-based framework of like executing decisions? I mean, where does that happen anywhere in the world? I think we're all at a loss. So one may say that's like boiling the ocean. So can we, as individual utility owners, start to realize that our part in this much larger system matter? And so that like that one utility, two utility, three utility, four utility is like that domino visual, right? So where are those utilities where, I get to say it, change the utility, change the world, that truly believe that they can empower those that understand this very dynamically different, changing, diverse grid and create the tool sets and then share it with others, right? Modular tool sets, open source platforms that have all of this information. Create a space where it's not, give me all your data and then I'm going to sell you back this really cool tool. Like, we are in a space where if we create that openness, all will benefit, and then the untapped potential of all of the markets that we constantly talk about could become a reality. But until we realize that we need to wholeheartedly work together and share the information and the knowledge, we're kind of a status quo. However, there's one or two or three utilities that can create that tool internally and then scale it. I think that's the greater space to be, and really is the essence of AEIC. For 140 years, these gentlemen have been coming together. I don't think the first woman appeared. I don't know yet. I haven't read all 140 years, so I won't quote. But it was definitely gentlemen at the beginning of the 70 years. They all wanted a common, there was a common bond to ensure that the grid operated safely, reliably, right? And there was always the affordability spark. And that genuine thread is like within the first 15 years, and I truly believe it'll show up. If you take away everything else, like, there are people, there are helpers that want to solve these problems. So how do we ignite that passion for those doers inside to kind of create that openness? So modular tool sets, understanding the full planning cycles of each of the components, build out your processes, confirm the accuracy that and validity it works for your own, and share it amongst your neighbors. Rinse and repeat. What do you think? And within that is a significant amount of stakeholder engagement, right? Like, as you're creating, you're sharing, you're going back to the drawing board. Like, there's a whole like change management, communication. Like, there's a big, large team that would really need to advocate and create that awareness.
Yeah, you're right there. So I have one last question which have two parts. So I'm going to try to get it out, because in my experience, the people in system planning in most utilities are the more experienced employees. And we know the current human resource challenges of the utilities when it comes to retirement and stuff like that. So the first question is, someone now leaving school, leaving college with a degree or master's or what have you, what advice will give them if they want to get into serious integrated system planning operations? I remember I learned that today, operations. And then the second part of it is, if my planning extraordinaire, Dr. Elizabeth Cook, have her way for integrated system planning operations of the future, what will that be? So I know it's a long question with two parts, but that's my last question for you today.
Well, one bit, I think, where, my career has taken me and what I've genuinely have, I've been very intentional on where I focus myself and where I believe, I can make a difference. So, and where I've come to be is this idea that how powerful and what a beautiful gift it was for my first boss. And so I'm going to shout out John Paserba. I was 4-year undergrad, right out of school, was excited that I got full access to highlighters and pens and notepads. That was where my headspace was. And yes, I had a 4-year degree in electrical engineering, but what it meant to this bigger world was far yet to be known. And so, and I actually just had this conversation at lunch yesterday with a few utility folk. This realization that there was an age gap when I was being employed. And John, and then really the team that he created that I was hired into. So I am grateful for all of them, is they were teachers at heart. They genuinely cared about furthering my knowledge base, if that makes sense. And I think that genuine thread is missing in a lot of new hirees. And they gave me an opportunity to feel almost instantly that I was valued and I can do hard things. Like, hey, you're an electrical engineer, you're probably really smart, so you're going to go do this. And it was really hard. And I was, but it was hard in a good way because they allowed me to feel that if I did fail, they would catch me. So they put me in front of a room of 30 plus, men, which I was typically mostly the only woman, talking about capacitor ring switching within 3 months of this job as if I was the expert. And they said, but if you get a question you can't answer, we'll be in the room. It was just true mentorship and being a teacher. I don't think they realized they were like that until as I've been growing into a leader and the power of creating a team or an organization and people around you, that you can be each other's teachers. So what I notice is we say this a lot, we have young employees or we have inexperienced employees or they don't know anything employees, but what if we said they're moldable and they're fantastic and we're going to create this amazing team? That's a whole different persona. Now it is challenging that a lot of spaces don't always have the technical experts, but I will say they exist. And so how do you create environments within utilities that promote hiring past employees or hiring consultants that really their job is to teach the next? And I had that opportunity as a consultant. I was about 10 years in and I was hired by utility. I was the transmission planning organization and they hired me to train 2 people that really to retain talent. It was beautiful. So my job as a consultant was to teach these 2 new engineers of how to run transmission planning studies. So that form exists. So I believe there needs to be more of that. There needs to be more realization that you as a boss, you as a leader, you really are looked at as someone who you're sharing a life with another being to ask them to produce and create content that may not be really relative to life. So why not create that mentorship, that teaching engagement? So I think I would lead first with that awareness and build workforce development teams that have those core philosophies and really, remember the words we choose to define the new members of this industry really will matter. So what do you think? I think I like that answer.
Well, I thank you. Besides stakeholder engagement, I always have to put in one day on human resource, right? Because it is so critical to ensure that continuation or continuity in the industry. We have a lot of seasoned and well-experienced engineers,
And
and
right. And we need to pull them in, retain them, and grow. And I think, putting workforce development, training, and expertise opportunities to the utility folk should be number one. And then it's let's execute, right? Together as a team. And sadly, I think maybe that's all industries, but we can, flip that pyramid. Kind of like we're flipping the food pyramid right now, but that's a whole other topic.
that's a whole lot of conversation. But, Dr. Cook, I truly appreciate your time. I really appreciate your insight on system planning operations. I have to put that in there.
Yep.
And, see you again next time. Don't be long now because I have quite a few questions on my next topic.
I look
So,
forward to it. So
okay.
thanks for showing up yourself and to be a teacher with me in this industry. Thanks.
Roger that, Captain.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.